Good morning everyone，早晨，大家早晨，大家好。歡迎大家咧嚟到我哋大陸香港中文大學大陸語認知研究所嘅 Symposium 啦。咁咧我係研究所嘅所長 Patrick Wong。咁好多謝大家咁踴躍嘅參與啦。咁我哋今年咧都好多人咧係 register 嘅。我哋呢個係我哋每年一度嘅 symposium 啦。咁我哋今年嗰個 topic 咧就係同讀寫啦，學習點樣去讀寫啦，同埋讀寫障礙咧係有關嘅。咁喺開始之前咧，我都想多謝咧我哋香港中文大學語言學及現代語言系嘅同事嘅幫忙啦，同埋我哋文學院啦，同埋最緊要咧就係我哋嘅sponsor 咧就係Dr. Sandy Ho Medical Development Foundation 嘅。咁咧都係喺咁多年裏邊咧foundation 咧都係好支持我哋BMI 嘅工作嘅。嗱，咁今日咧，我哋有三個唔同嘅 speakers 啦。咁大家都可能知道咧，開頭咧，我哋係有 Professor Ann Castles 咧喺澳洲嚟嘅。咁因為咧，佢突然之間咧係有啲事咧嚟唔到啦。咁所以咧，我哋好多謝咧Professor James Booth 咧，就係喺好last minute 嘅情況之下咧，就幫我哋咧係可以俾呢個咁嘅 keynote 嘅講座。咁我哋都係多謝佢啦。一陣間我用英文咧就多謝佢一次。嗱，咁大家而家見到咧，我哋有啲 slides 啦喺度轉緊啦。咁咧都想同大家咧講下咧，我哋有唔同嘅研究項目咧係進行緊嘅。而我哋兩個研究項目咧喺我哋香港中文大學係進行緊嘅。不過呢啲係可以上網嘅 study 嘅，所以咧上網嘅研究，所以咧澳門嘅家長咧都可以參與嘅。咁呢個第一個研究咧就係關於 K3 即係幼稚園高班啦，到小三嘅學生咧。咁我哋係設計咗有啲係網上嘅語言嘅遊戲咧，希望透過一啲網上嘅語言遊戲咧，可以促進到咧佢哋嘅語言發展嘅。咁呢個研究咧就係包括我哋會有語言治療師喺網上做一個評估啦，然之後咧就有啲遊戲俾佢哋玩啦，咁跟住咧係再做一個評估嘅。咁咧如果你哋有興趣咧，可以照呢個 QR code 啦，咁叫咗呢個 QR code 之後咧就可以上網登記就得啦。咁呢個係語言遊戲 K3 高班到小三嘅小朋友，係用廣東話學廣東話為母語嘅小朋友嘅。咁第二個研究咧，好多人都問呢個問題。頭先就係咧，係關於我哋有一個評估網上嘅評估嘅。咁咧呢個係一個問卷嘅形式去評估你小朋友嗰個語言發展嘅。咁就係俾8至30個大嘅家長啦，嘅小朋友，如果個家長係填寫呢個嘅問卷嘅，咁你係照呢個 QR code 啦。咁咧個 activation code 咧，你要去輸入嗰個啟動嗰個密碼嘅，就係 BMI 22就係嗰個啟動嗰個密碼。咁你打咗入去，跟住有一啲問題關於問你咧，然之後咧就係有一啲詞彙咧係問下你個小朋友識唔識嘅。你做完到最後咧，我哋會俾一個分你嘅，咁等你大約知道咧你個小朋友咧其實而家語言發展去到咩地步。我哋呢個評估咧，呢個嘅研究項目咧，其實係想改良咧而家我哋現有嘅工具。我哋俾你嘅分咧係而家現有工具係俾你嘅分嘅，但係我哋都係做緊一個研究係想改良呢個咁嘅測試㗎。咁希望大家咧都係參與。咁最後咧如果你哋想知道多啲關於我哋大陸語言諮研究所嘅唔同嘅資訊啊，我哋嘅講座啊，我哋嘅研究項目咧，就請你咧就係加入我哋嘅 Facebook follow 我哋，咁咧你就會收到我哋唔同嘅資訊㗎。OK，咁好啦，咁咧就我哋而家咧就開始，咁咧so James, I was explaining to the audience that you were our hero because you stepped in the very last minute to help
I
us
heard
deliver.
last minute and I heard Ann Castle, so I figured you were saying something about that.
Yeah. So thank you very much. And let me introduce Professor James Booth. Professor James Booth was actually my colleague at Northwestern University for about 10 years before we moved to different institutions. So Professor Booth is the Patricia and Rhodes Hart Professor of Educational Neuroscience in the Department of Psychology and Human Development at Vanderbilt University. The focus of his current research is to understand the brain mechanisms of the development of language and reading in typical and atypical populations. Professor Booth has been continuously funded by the federal government for over 2 decades and has published extensively in diverse journals. He has served in various roles both within and outside of the university, such as departmental chairperson, grant review member, and journal editor. Professor Booth aims to facilitate the interaction between the fields of development, cognition, and neuroscience. And the topic of today's talk is, unimodal brain areas become more multisensory with reading development. And if you have questions, so Professor Booth is going to talk for about 40 minutes, I think. And then there will be like about 5 minutes to ask questions if you'd like to ask him questions. You can type the questions in the chat box in either Chinese or English is fine, and we can translate. And then because it's really late in the US, we're going to let him go back to relax and have his evening, and then we'll move on to our second talk. So James?
Okay, great, thanks. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. So that's a portion of it, but let me get this slideshow going. So I can see you, and hopefully you can see my slides. Is that okay? Okay, you can hear me just fine. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Patrick, for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity for tonight to be presenting some of my work. So thanks to the Chinese University of Hong Kong and the Brain and Mind Institute. I'm really looking forward to talking about our work on reading and dyslexia. Before I do that, I'd like to quickly acknowledge the grant support that I've gotten over the years from various institutes here in the United States. And I'd also like to thank the Brain Development Lab, the context in which I've done my work. And of course, the many families who participated in our studies kind of over the last 25 years now. So here's an outline of what I'd like to talk about today. I'd like to first review the brain bases of reading, and then dive into talking about a couple different brain regions that seem to be really important. The fusiform gyrus, which is involved in orthographic processing or processing spelling patterns. The superior temporal gyrus, which is really important for phonological processing or processing sound patterns. And then wrap up with our work trying to predict reading gains based on neuroimages. And then I'll have a few short conclusions. Before I get started in terms of the brain work, I'd like to just note that studying reading, of course, is very important, particularly in the US. This is some data from the US Department of Education that categorizes students into 4 different levels. You can see here advanced, proficient, basic, and below basic. And if you look at these percentages here in grade 4 and grade 8, you can see that about 25 to 30% of the children are below basic on reading. So of course, there's a lot of work to do in the US in terms of improving reading levels. And the good news is that we can do something about it. The literature is pretty conclusive in terms of the importance of phonics. So this is a meta-analysis, is pretty old by now, so we've known this for a while, which shows that essentially combining phonics training with phonological awareness training results in substantial improvements in reading. So this is about 2/3 of a standard deviation. So this is training in the alphabetic principle. Training in phonological awareness results in these substantial improvements, more than if you just train phonological awareness alone. So it's very clear that training the mapping between orthography and phonology is absolutely crucial for improving reading skill in English. So before I start talking about the brain work, I'd like to just orient those of you who are less familiar with the brain about some important regions involved in reading. I've already mentioned orthography, or knowledge of spelling patterns, that engages the fusiform gyrus, which is along the kind of the ventral surface of the brain here, the inferior surface of the brain, kind of in the visual association area. Phonological processing involves the superior temporal gyrus, which is kind of in the superior temporal area. This is the auditory association area that's involved in processing sound patterns of language. We're going to actually focus on those two areas mostly in this talk today. Of course, there's a distributed network involved in reading, involving the inferior portions of the parietal cortex. People talk about the inferior parietal as really important in kind of mapping between spelling and sound patterns. There's also this area that's kind of sandwiched in between the superior and the inferior temporal cortex called the middle temporal gyrus. And a lot of people talk about that as being involved in your knowledge about meaning. So you can think about this as your vocabulary knowledge. And then, of course, you have frontal cortex at the kind of front of the brain, which is involved in lots of different things. One thing that it certainly is involved in is kind of like accessing or retrieving information in posterior cortex and manipulating that information to produce some, behavioral outcome. So that's kind of like an overall view of the brain. But as I said, we're going to really focus here on two areas, the fusiform and the superior temporal gyrus. Fortunately, there's been a lot of work looking at reading development and also dyslexia. I'm going to show you actually a series of 4 meta-analyses, which give you a good sense of how the reading brain develops and how it is affected in the case of dyslexia. And what you see here is one meta-analysis, which is essentially just a combination of a bunch of individual studies to look at, consistent patterns of activation across all these studies. And you can see here on the top, this is kind of like an overlap of children and adults, and you can see this is kind of your kind of prototypical reading network that you see. And all the nodes that we just mentioned are represented here. What I think is particularly important is this bottom panel, which you see here. You can see in blue, this is greater activation for adults compared to children, and in red, greater activation for children compared to adults. So children seem to really rely on this phonology area in the superior temporal cortex, whereas adults seem to rely more on the orthography area in the fusiform cortex. So this is consistent with an idea that's developing in the field that there's this kind of superior to inferior shift in the neural basis of reading. So initially, children rely a lot on phonological processing, and then they shift to reliance on quickly recognizing spelling patterns. So it's consistent with the behavioral literature as well. What happens in the case of dyslexia? This is another meta-analysis. It's pretty old by now, but the findings have more or less held up. Here you can see in blue and in red, underactivation in dyslexia, and in yellow and green, overactivation in dyslexia. These are the separate maps. These are actually maps that show developmental changes in under or overactivation. So I will focus on those here. And what they show is that, kind of more in this kind of superior region, you see evidence for underactivation of children, whereas, so that would be underactivation of dyslexic children. Whereas in the kind of the fusiform, these more inferior areas, you have evidence for underactivation in adults. So the neural correlates in children tend to be more in phonologically based regions, whereas the neural alteration in adults tends to be in orthographically based regions. So this is consistent with the developmental model that I just reviewed in the previous slide. Not only are there functional differences, these functional differences actually co-localize with structural differences. So you can look at amount of gray matter, which is essentially cell bodies. And you can see here, I'll just point out one area here, you can see that these differences in gray matter, so reduced gray matter, co-localize with reduced activation during reading in those with dyslexia. So you have this really nice convergence of both the functional and the structural studies showing this alteration. So that's gray matter, but there's additional support for kind of alteration of this posterior cortex in the form of studies that look at white matter. So white matter are the kind of like connections between brain areas. This is an early study showing that there's less white matter in those with dyslexia in the fusiform gyrus, but also in areas underlying the superior temporal cortex. This is an at-risk pre-reader, so this is before children even learn to read. So the idea is that, you know, these neural alterations that you see in dyslexia aren't a result of lack of exposure to reading, but rather they seem to be pre-existing. So before kids even start to read. So you really have this kind of convergence of studies suggesting these the neural alteration in these two areas, the superior temporal cortex and the inferior temporal or the fusiform cortex. So with those meta-analyses as a backdrop, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our work that has investigated development and dyslexia. We have used single word tasks. Of course, single word speed and accuracy of single word decoding is very important for skilled reading. So we've done this in the context of a rhyming judgment. So pairs of words are presented to children, and they're asked to determine whether they rhyme or they don't rhyme. And we present these unimodally, so that means in the visual or the auditory modality, but we also present them cross-modally. So say one word in the auditory, one word in the visual modality. And the final kind of manipulation we do here is that sometimes the words are, we refer to as non-conflicting versus conflicting, or another term is congruent versus incongruent. But you can see here the conflicting, the kind of the spelling gives you one answer and the sound gives you a different answer right here. So here you have to say rhyming, despite the fact that they look different. Here you need to say they're not rhyming, despite the fact that they looked similar, right? So these are conflicting and these are non-conflicting. So we've used these tasks in lots of different studies now, and I'll tell you about that work shortly. Before I do that, though, I'd like to do like a cognitive analysis of what these tasks require. But remember, I said that they can be presented in the auditory or the visual modality. Of course, if they're presented in the auditory modality, then that's going to engage phonological processing, probably engage the superior temporal gyrus. If they're presented in the visual modality, of course, that's going to engage orthographic processing, probably engage the fusiform gyrus. If they're presented auditorily and visually, so in both modalities, it's going to engage both of these areas and both of these processes. But of course, you could process something in the auditory modality, right? And you could map to the orthography, right? So even though it's auditorily presented, you could access the spelling pattern, right? Or vice versa, it could be presented visually. And of course, you could activate the phonological representation, even though it's just visually presented. Okay, so where have we been so far? This is the overview of the brain bases of reading, and I'd like to kind of summarize it by saying developmental and skill effects have been established in the fusiform gyrus for orthographic processing. And these developmental and skill effects have also been established in the superior temporal gyrus for phonological processing. So now I'd like to dive deep into the fusiform cortex and its role in orthographic processing and tell you about a few of our studies. So again, these are word rhyming studies that we've used, and we've looked at developmental changes. Usually it's in the early elementary to middle school range, so 9 to 15 years. And a lot of our studies are functional studies. And one of the central kind of core kind of arguments in reading is that in order to be a skilled reader, you need to automatically activate phonology when you're reading. So So the argument is that, even though it's visually presented, you're going to map to the phonological representation. So you'd expect to see developmental increases in the connectivity between kind of the fusiform and the superior temporal gyrus when you're reading words. And in fact, that's what we show. This is the connectivity strength. This is age. You see this developmental increase in the connectivity between the fusiform and the superior temporal. Interestingly, we find that only for conflicting. Conflicting is where the spelling pattern and the sound pattern give a different answer. The fact that we only get it for conflicting suggests that the fusiform becomes phonologically structured as children get older and become skilled readers. So what about in the case of dyslexia? Well, I just showed you that meta-analysis, which was very convincing, showing kind of reduced activation in the reading network. We're just going to focus here on the fusiform. And we've also shown in our studies reduced activation in the fusiform when children with dyslexia are reading words. But we've shown that these effects are stronger when children are reading words that have conflicting representations as compared to non-conflicting representations. So the effects are larger for conflicting. So this suggests that phonological information has less of an influence on visual word processing in dyslexics as compared to control kids. Another way to examine this kind of interactivity between orthographic and phonological representations is to look at whether when just listening to words, there are group differences in activation of the fusiform cortex. Now, remember, when you're listening to words and making a rhyming judgment, you can do that just based on how the word sounds. You don't need to activate the spelling pattern. But in fact, typical readers automatically activate the spelling pattern when they're listening to words and making rhyming judgments. However, those with dyslexia do not automatically activate the fusiform cortex when listening to words and making rhyming judgments. So this suggests that those with dyslexia have less kind of automatic interaction between these two kinds of representations. So we've talked about studies presenting words visually. We've talked about studies presenting words auditorily. But we've also done studies, as I said, presenting words both auditorily and visually. So that gives you a little more direct measure of kind of multisensory processing or audiovisual processing. So we were very interested to see whether there were skill-based effects in multisensory processing in the fusiform gyrus. And in fact, we showed that the difference between audiovisual and unimodal was correlated with reading skill. So in other words, the higher the reading skill, the greater the difference between audiovisual and unimodal in this fusiform gyrus. So this is kind of like direct evidence suggesting that higher reading skill is associated with more multisensory processing in the fusiform cortex. So that's what's summarized here, is that higher reading skill is related to greater connectivity with and multisensory processing in the fusiform. Okay. So I'd like to move on to the second area that we'll be talking about in the lecture today, and that is the superior temporal gyrus and its role in phonological processing. So our previous studies showed that the orthographic region, the fusiform, was sensitive to phonology. So we wanted to see whether this phonological region, the superior temporal, was related to orthographic processing. So we've shown developmental increases in the amount of activation in the superior temporal gyrus when listening to words. Here you can see English children compared to English adults. This is for conflicting. Here's for non-conflicting. You see there's an increase, but it's not quite as big. Now remember, they're just listening to these words, right? So there's no reason that conflict should matter, right? Because they're just listening. But if conflict does matter, that means that the spelling or the orthographic pattern is affecting their auditory processing. And that's happening more so as kids get older. I've also done quite a bit of work collaboratively with folks in Beijing looking at Chinese. And interestingly, you can see here that this developmental increase for the non-conflicting and the conflicting isn't as large in Chinese. So this suggests that the alphabetic nature, the systematic mapping between letters and sounds in English kind of restructures phonological representations in English children, but it does not have the same effect in those who are learning to read in Chinese. And in fact, a more direct way of looking at this is to see whether reading skill is related to this conflict effect in the superior temporal cortex. And what we've shown is that reading skill in English children, better reading skill is associated with more activation in the superior temporal for the English children, but there's no relationship for the Chinese children. So reading skill is not related to the conflict effect in the superior temporal for the Chinese children, suggesting that learning to read doesn't kind of fundamentally restructure the nature of phonological representations in the superior temporal cortex in Chinese children as it does in English children. So those are studies that looked at auditory processing, again, to get a more direct measure of kind of multisensory processing in the superior temporal. We'd want to present things both in the auditory and the visual modality. And what we see here is a study that has done that. We looked at cross-modal, so this is auditory visual, and we looked at just auditory, and we looked at just visual. And we looked at different areas of the superior temporal cortex. I won't focus on those, but what you can see here is that we've shown that as you get higher and higher reading skill, you have a larger congruency effect just for the multisensory, just for the auditory visual presentation, right? So this suggests that this phonological region becomes more multisensory with more reading experience. So to wrap up this section, I'd like to conclude that higher reading skill seems to be related to greater multisensory processing in the superior temporal cortex. Okay, so the last part of the talk, and then I'll just kind of wrap up with some conclusions, is to talk about our work using neuroimages to predict reading gains. So it turns out that you can use behavioral measures to predict gains in reading, but the behavioral measures are only modest in predicting these gains. Or in predicting response to intervention, right? Because the goal would be to use behavior or neuroimaging to see who's going to benefit from what kind of intervention, right? So it's really important to be able to kind of like predict these developmental trajectories in children. So it turns out that behavioral measures are pretty modest, and the largest predictors of subsequent reading gains are, not surprisingly, initial reading skill, so word reading skill, initial phonological awareness, and less so, but still reliable measures of vocabulary. There's inconsistent effects for cognitive measures. So things like working memory or visual spatial processing, those aren't very consistently predictive of gains in reading. So I guess the main conclusion is that behavioral measures are okay, but there's a lot of variance that is left unexplained. So, so our goal with neuroimaging is to kind of supplement the behavioral measures to see if we can predict additional variance in reading gains, with the eventual goal of using neuroimaging for early assessment and intervention. So this is actually our first work looking at this. It's a relatively small sample, but it's consistent with other later work showing that activation of the fusiform gyrus during reading predicts gains in reading. In this case, it was over a 3 to 6 year period Here's the fusiform cortex. This is the area that was predictive. Turns out that it wasn't really predictive of younger, but it was predictive of older. Actually, we have other studies suggesting that it's actually more phonological regions that are predictive of gains in younger kids, which is consistent again with this kind of dorsal or this superior to inferior shift in the neural basis of reading. So more reliance on phonology early, later reliance on orthography. So this kind of data is consistent with that. So that's in the visual modality. We've also looked at auditory processing and to see whether auditory processing is related to gains in reading over time. Here's a sampling of that line of work, where we show that the superior temporal gyrus predicts reading gains from 6 to 7.5-year-olds. So this is the area that was predictive, and we can see the scatter plot here. So this is a rhyming task. We look at the amount of activation at time 1, and we look to see whether this predicts reading gains. So changes from reading at time 1 to time 2, and we see that there is a reliable relationship. So more robust activation in the phonological region is predictive of these reading gains, say a year and a half later. This is over and above behavior, right? So this is a unique variance is being explained by neuroimages. So those are functional studies, both in the visual and the auditory modality. But of course, you could also use structural data to see if that is also predictive of gains in reading. And we've done that work. Other people have done that work too. Actually, one of the meta-analyses that I presented to you earlier looked at white matter, right? And to see whether that was different between at-risk versus not at-risk readers. So this kind of work is kind of consistent with that. It turns out that there's a big white matter bundle that connects posterior and anterior reading regions. So temporal parietal cortex with frontal cortex. It actually is divided out into 3 separate tracks. So the direct, the anterior, and the posterior. I won't get into detail to these different tracks, just to note that the direct track, which connects kind of superior temporal to frontal cortex, seems to be really important in audiovisual processing. So we wanted to focus particularly on the direct track and its role in predicting reading gains. And that's what you see here. You see that kind of the integrity of that white matter tract, so the direct segment of the arcuate fasciculus. So the integrity of the white matter of that tract was predictive of gains in reading over a 2 to 3 year period, right? So the idea is that, more white matter, better communication early on is associated with enhanced reading gains over this 2 to 3 year period. So I'd like to conclude, and it looks like I'm doing okay on time, I guess. So just to wrap up, the fusiform gyrus is crucial for orthographic processing, and the superior temporal gyrus is crucial for phonological processing. Lower reading skill is associated with less robust activation in the fusiform and the superior temporal cortex, especially for multisensory processing. The fusiform and the superior temporal cortex predict subsequent reading gains. This is over and above behavior. So it's important to assess and intervene early to improve the mapping between orthographic and phonological representations. So with that, I'll end and see if there are any questions. I don't know. How did I do on time? Do I have time for questions?
Yeah, you do. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, James. This is wonderful.